There comes a moment in every empath's life when they suddenly realize they've spent years, maybe decades, trying to justify their existence, explaining why they feel too much, defending why they need time alone, apologizing for being too sensitive, too emotional, too deep, too intense. You've been translating yourself into a language that other people can accept, diluting your truth so it doesn't make anyone uncomfortable, shrinking yourself so you fit into spaces that were never designed for someone like you. And one day, without warning, something inside you simply refuses to do it anymore. Not with anger, not with rebellion, but with a quiet, profound knowing that the explaining has to stop because it's killing the very essence of who you are. Carl Jung understood this better than most. He knew that we spend the first half of our lives building a personality that the world can accept, and if we're lucky, we spend the second half dismantling it to discover who we actually are beneath all that performance. But for empaths, the performance is particularly exhausting because it's not just about conforming to social expectations. It's about constantly managing other people's reactions to your sensitivity, constantly trying to make them understand why you experience the world differently, constantly defending your right to feel what you feel without being labeled as dramatic or broken or too much. And here's what nobody tells you about this moment when you stop explaining. It's not a moment of triumph. It's not empowering at first. It's terrifying. Because your entire identity has been built around making other people comfortable with who you are. You've been the translator, the bridge, the one who makes sure everyone understands your intentions so they won't misinterpret you, judge you, or worse, leave you. When you stop explaining, you have to face the fear that's been driving all of that explaining in the first place. The fear that if people don't understand you, they won't love you. The fear that your authentic self in its raw, unexplained form is simply too much for this world to handle. Jung called this the encounter with the self, the moment when you stop living from your persona and start touching something deeper, something truer, something that doesn't need external validation to know its worth. For empaths, this encounter is particularly painful because your entire empathic ability has been weaponized against you. You've been told that feeling deeply is a weakness, that caring too much is naive, that your sensitivity is something you need to overcome rather than something sacred you need to protect. So when you finally stop explaining yourself, you're not just changing a behavior. You're confronting every wound, every rejection, every moment you were told that who you are is fundamentally wrong. But here's the truth that will change everything. The moment you stop explaining is the moment healing actually begins. Not before. Not while you're still trying to make people understand. But in that brave, vulnerable space where you finally accept that some people will never understand, and you choose yourself anyway. So let me ask you something, and I want you to really feel into this. Who are you still explaining yourself to, and what would happen if you just stopped? The explaining starts so early that you don't even remember beginning it. It starts in childhood when you cry at a movie and someone tells you it's just fiction. Stop being so dramatic. When you can't go to the loud birthday party because the noise feels like it's crawling under your skin and someone says you're being difficult. When you know something is wrong with your mother even though she's smiling and your father tells you to stop imagining things. So you learn that what you feel, what you sense, what you know in your bones cannot be trusted. You learn that your inner experience needs to be justified, rationalized, explained away until it fits into a framework that other people can accept. Jung talked about the wounded child archetype, this part of us that carries the pain of not being seen, not being understood, not being accepted for who we truly are. For empaths, this wound runs particularly deep because your gift, your ability to feel and sense beyond what's visible, is the very thing that gets invalidated over and over again. You're not just wounded by what happened to you. You're wounded by the constant message that your perception of reality is wrong, that you're making things up, that you're too sensitive for your own good. So you develop this elaborate system of explaining. You learn to preface everything you say with disclaimers and apologies. I know this sounds crazy, but I'm probably being too sensitive, but I don't want to upset you, but you learn to soften your truth so much that by the time it reaches the other person, it's barely recognizable as truth anymore. It's a watered-down version, a palatable version, a version that won't make waves or cause discomfort or risk rejection, And you tell yourself this is just being considerate, just being mature, just being conscious of other people's feelings. But really, what you're doing is betraying yourself over and over again. The explaining becomes a shield, a way to control how people perceive you. If you can just make them understand your intentions, your reasons, your logic, then maybe they won't judge you. Maybe they won't leave you. Maybe they won't confirm your deepest fear that you are, in fact, too much for this world. But Jung knew something crucial about shields. Whatever we use to protect ourselves eventually becomes a prison. The very mechanism you develop to keep yourself safe, to manage other people's reactions, to maintain connection, becomes the thing that keeps you disconnected from your own soul. And the exhaustion of it all slowly builds over the years. The constant monitoring of how you're being received, the endless mental gymnastics of figuring out how to say what you need to say without triggering someone else's defensiveness, the perpetual anxiety about being misunderstood. It's like you're living your life through a translator, and the translation is never quite right. Something essential always gets lost. Your energy depletes, your voice weakens, and the person you're explaining to still doesn't understand. Because the explaining was never going to make them understand. Understanding can only happen between people who are willing to meet each other in vulnerability, not in defense. The relationships you build during your explaining years are built on a foundation of inequality. You're constantly adjusting yourself, constantly making sure the other person is comfortable, constantly managing the emotional climate so that nothing gets too intense or too real. And the other person gets very comfortable with this arrangement. They get to remain unchanged while you do all the emotional labor. They get to be who they are without explanation while you're constantly justifying your existence. Jung would call this a shadow projection, where you're carrying not just your own sensitivity, but also the disowned sensitivity of the people around you. Because here's what happens when you're always explaining yourself. You attract people who need you to explain yourself. People who are uncomfortable with depth, with emotion, with anything that can't be neatly categorized and controlled. People who would rather have you dilute your truth than do their own work of expanding their capacity to hold complexity. And you accommodate them. You make yourself smaller so they can stay the same size. You turn down your light so they don't have to confront their own darkness. And you call this love, this compromise, this relationship. But it's not love. It's a reenactment of your original wound, playing out over and over again. The narcissists are particularly drawn to empaths who are in explaining mode. Because a narcissist doesn't want to understand you. They want you to constantly try to make them understand you. It keeps you focused on them, keeps you working for their approval, keeps you believing that if you just find the right words, the right explanation, they'll finally see you. But they won't. They can't. Because seeing you would require them to see themselves, and that's the one thing a narcissist cannot do. So you stay stuck in this endless loop of explaining, justifying, defending, trying to prove your worth to someone who has no interest in actually knowing you. And even in healthier relationships, the explaining creates distance. Because when you're always explaining, you're not being, you're not present, you're not vulnerable. You're in your head managing and controlling and trying to prevent misunderstanding. But real intimacy doesn't happen in the explanation. It happens in the raw, undefended moment when you let yourself be seen without trying to control how you're seen. When you trust that your truth, even if it's not understood, is still valid. When you stop trying to make yourself acceptable and start being authentic. Jung said that loneliness does not come from having no people about one, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself. And this is the deepest loneliness of the empath who's always explaining. You can be surrounded by people, in relationship after relationship, conversation after conversation, and still feel utterly alone, because you're not really communicating what's important to you. You're communicating a sanitized, explained, justified version of what's important to you. And your soul knows the difference. Your soul feels the loneliness of never being truly met. Then comes the moment of reckoning. It might come after a particularly exhausting conversation where you spent an hour trying to explain why something hurt you, only to be told you're being too sensitive. It might come after you realize you've apologized 5 times in a single day for things that don't require apology. It might come in a quiet moment alone when you suddenly hear yourself rehearsing an explanation for a boundary you want to set, and something inside you just says no. No more. I'm done. Not with anger, but with a bone-deep weariness that makes continuing impossible. This is what Jung called the enantiodromia, the moment when something that has been pushed to an extreme suddenly flips into its opposite. You've been explaining yourself so much, so constantly, so exhaustingly, that the psyche can no longer sustain it. Something has to give, and what gives is your willingness to keep performing, keep justifying, keep trying to make people understand what they may never be capable of understanding. You reach a breaking point, but it's not a breakdown. It's a breakthrough into a new way of being that you didn't even know was possible. The decision to stop explaining doesn't usually come as a grand declaration. It comes quietly, privately, in the small moments. Someone asks you why you need to leave the party early, and instead of launching into an explanation about your sensitivity to noise and your need to recharge, you simply say, "I'm leaving now," and you leave. Someone questions your boundary, and instead of defending it with reasons and justifications, you simply say, "This is what works for me." Someone tells you you're being too sensitive, and instead of trying to convince them otherwise, you simply let them have their opinion while you hold your own truth. At first, it feels terrifying. Every time you don't explain, there's a flood of anxiety. They're going to think you're rude. They're going to be hurt. They're going to misunderstand. They're going to leave. And sometimes they do. Sometimes people who were comfortable with the explained, justified, apologetic version of you are not comfortable with this new version that simply exists without defense. And watching them leave is painful. It confirms the fear that drove all the explaining in the first place, that the real you, unexplained and unfiltered, is too much. But then something unexpected starts to happen. In the space where you used to exhaust yourself with explanations, there's suddenly energy. There's breath. There's room for you to actually feel what you feel, instead of immediately having to translate it for someone else. You start to notice that you're less anxious, less depleted, less resentful. Because resentment, Jung understood, is what happens when we betray ourselves to please others. And every time you explained yourself to someone who had no genuine interest in understanding you, you were betraying yourself. Now that you've stopped, the resentment begins to lift. Think about this carefully. What would you have time and energy for if you weren't constantly explaining yourself to people who don't want to understand? When you stop explaining, you create a vacuum. And nature abhors a vacuum, so something has to fill that space. What fills it slowly at first is your own voice. Not the voice that's been trained to accommodate and justify and soften, but the voice that knows, the voice that feels, the voice that doesn't need permission to exist. Jung called this the voice of the self, the deep inner authority that exists beyond the ego's need for approval. For empaths, finding this voice is particularly profound because you've been so trained to prioritize everyone else's voice, everyone else's feelings, everyone else's interpretation of reality, that your own inner authority has been buried under layers of conditioning. This is where the real healing begins, not in understanding why you became an over-explainer, not in analyzing your childhood wounds or your relationship patterns, though that work has its place. The healing happens in the active practice of not explaining. Every time you state your truth and then stop. Every time you set a boundary and don't justify it. Every time you feel your feelings without needing to defend their validity. You're rewiring decades of neural pathways. You're teaching your nervous system that you are safe even when you're not understood. You are worthy even when you're not validated. You are enough even when you're not explained. Jung understood that healing doesn't happen through insight alone. It happens through active engagement with the unconscious patterns that run our lives. For the empath, the unconscious pattern is the belief that your existence requires justification, that your sensitivity needs to be rationalized, that your depth needs to be apologized for. When you stop explaining, you're not just changing a behavior. You're challenging a core belief system that has been governing your entire life. And the psyche will resist this. It will create anxiety, guilt, fear, because the explaining has been your survival strategy. And the psyche doesn't easily release survival strategies even when they're no longer serving you. This is where you need to be gentle with yourself. There will be times when you slip back into explaining, times when the old fear grips you, and you find yourself justifying a simple no or defending a basic boundary. And that's okay. Healing isn't linear. Jung spoke of the spiral nature of psychological growth, where we revisit the same themes at deeper levels, each time integrating more of ourselves. The goal isn't to never explain again. The goal is to notice when you're explaining from fear versus when you're communicating from authenticity. There's a difference between sharing your inner experience because you want to, and explaining yourself because you're afraid of the consequences if you don't. As you practice not explaining, you'll start to notice who in your life is comfortable with the unexplained you, who can let you be without needing to understand every nuance of your internal world, who respects your boundaries without requiring a dissertation on why you've set them. These are your people. These are the relationships that have the capacity to hold your full humanity without needing you to shrink it into something more manageable. The silence that follows the end of explaining is profound. At first, it might feel empty, even uncomfortable. You've been filling every space with words, with justifications, with careful explanations designed to prevent misunderstanding. When you stop, there's a spaciousness that can feel unfamiliar, almost exposing. But if you can sit with that discomfort, if you can resist the urge to fill the silence with more explaining, something sacred begins to emerge. You start to hear yourself. Not the performing self, not the accommodating self, but the essential self that has been waiting underneath all that noise for you to finally listen. Jung believed that the psyche is always speaking to us, always trying to guide us toward wholeness. But we have to be quiet enough to hear it. When you're constantly explaining yourself to others, you're not listening to yourself. You're focused outward, monitoring reactions, adjusting your message, managing perceptions. But when you stop explaining, when you create that inner silence, your own wisdom finally has space to emerge. You start to know what you need without having to justify it. You start to feel what's right for you without needing consensus. You start to trust your own inner knowing in a way you never could when you were always seeking external validation through explanation. This is also when you begin to understand the difference between explaining and communicating. Communication is bidirectional. It's about genuine exchange, mutual understanding, shared vulnerability. Explaining is unidirectional. It's about defending yourself, justifying your existence, trying to prevent judgment. When you stop explaining, you don't stop communicating. In fact, your communication becomes clearer, more honest, more powerful, because you're no longer trying to control how you're received. You're simply offering your truth and allowing the other person to do with it what they will. The people who truly love you, the people who are capable of real intimacy, will appreciate this shift. They don't need you to explain yourself. They never did. They were willing to meet you in the mystery and the not knowing, in the space where two people can be different and that difference is okay. But the people who needed you to explain, who were uncomfortable with your unexplained existence, will struggle with this new version of you. And you'll have to decide, over and over again, whether to go back to explaining to keep them comfortable or to hold your ground in your authentic, unexplained truth. Jung said that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But he also knew that this privilege comes with a cost. The cost is often relationships that cannot evolve, people who cannot grow with you, connections that were built on who you were pretending to be rather than who you actually are. And letting go of these relationships, even when you know they're not serving you, is grief. Real grief. Because you're not just losing the person, you're losing the version of yourself that existed in relationship to them. Where are you still explaining yourself out of fear rather than genuine desire to share? And what's that costing you? As the healing deepens, you start to reclaim the energy you've been pouring into explanations. And that energy is substantial. Think about how much mental and emotional bandwidth you've been using to craft explanations, to anticipate objections, to defend your sensitivity, to justify your needs. That's energy that could have been going into your creativity, your growth, your joy, your actual life. When you stop explaining, that energy returns to you. And at first, you might not even know what to do with it. You've been in deficit for so long that having surplus feels strange. But gradually you learn to redirect that reclaimed energy inward, into self-discovery, into healing, into the deep, quiet work of integrating all the parts of yourself that you've been keeping separate to make other people comfortable. Jung called this the individuation process, the journey of becoming a whole, undivided self. For empaths, individuation requires reclaiming your sensitivity not as something that needs to be explained or justified, but as an inherent part of your being that is neither good nor bad, neither curse nor gift. It simply is. You also begin to understand that your empathic nature doesn't require other people's validation to be real. For years, you've been trying to get people to understand what it's like to feel everything, to absorb energy, to be impacted by things that others don't even notice. And when they didn't understand, when they dismissed your experience or told you that you were making it up, some part of you started to doubt yourself. Maybe I am too sensitive. Maybe I am making too big a deal of this. Maybe there is something wrong with me. But now, in the silence of not explaining, you reconnect with the direct experience of your empathic ability. You know what you feel. You know what you sense. And you no longer need anyone else to validate that knowing. This is a radical shift, because our culture teaches us that shared reality is the only valid reality. If other people don't experience what you experience, then maybe you're not experiencing it at all. But Jung understood that there are multiple layers of reality, multiple dimensions of perception. What the empath perceives is real, even if others don't perceive it. Your sensitivity is picking up on energies, emotions, unspoken dynamics that others are filtered from experiencing. That doesn't make you wrong. It makes you attuned to a different frequency. When you stop trying to make people understand this, when you stop trying to prove that your experience is valid, you step into a quiet confidence. Not arrogance, not superiority, just a grounded knowing that you see what you see, you feel what you feel, and that's enough. You don't need to convince anyone. You don't need to defend yourself against people who insist that their limited perception is the only perception. You simply know your truth and you live from that truth, regardless of who understands it. And here's the beautiful paradox. The less you explain yourself, the more the right people start to understand you. Because you're no longer performing or defending, you're simply being. And authentic being is recognizable to other authentic beings. The final stage of this healing journey is when you realize that not explaining yourself isn't just about protecting your energy or maintaining boundaries. It's about honoring the sacred nature of your inner experience. Jung believed that the soul has its own language, its own way of knowing that transcends rational explanation. When you're always trying to explain yourself in terms that other people can understand, you're translating soul language into ego language, and something essential gets lost in that translation. When you stop explaining, you're saying to your soul, I trust you. I trust that what I'm feeling is real even if I can't articulate it. I trust that my sensitivity has value even if others don't see it. I trust that my needs are legitimate even if I can't justify them with logic. This trust, this deep honoring of your own inner experience, is what allows true healing to occur. Because the wound of the empath isn't just about other people not understanding you. It's about you not understanding yourself, you not trusting yourself, you not believing that your inner world is valid unless it can be explained and validated by others. As you heal, you'll find that your relationships transform. Some will end, and that's painful but necessary. Others will deepen in ways you never imagined possible, because you're finally showing up as your authentic self, rather than as a carefully explained, justified version of yourself. You'll attract new people who are drawn to your authenticity, who don't need you to be anything other than what you are. These relationships feel different, easier, more honest, more spacious, because there's no performance, no explaining, no exhausting yourself to be understood. You'll also discover that when you stop explaining yourself to others, you stop needing to explain yourself to yourself. You stop the constant inner dialogue of justifying why you feel what you feel, why you need what you need, why you are the way you are. You simply are. And in that simple being, there is a peace that surpasses anything you experienced while you were constantly defending your existence. Jung called this the achievement of the self, but it doesn't feel like an achievement. It feels like coming home to a part of yourself that was always there, waiting for you to stop explaining long enough to notice. So wherever you are on this journey, Whether you're still in the thick of over-explaining, whether you're just beginning to practice the art of not defending yourself, whether you're tasting the freedom of authentic being, know that every step matters. Every time you catch yourself about to explain and choose silence instead. Every time you state a boundary without justification. Every time you honor your truth even when it's not understood. You're healing. Not just yourself, but the collective wound that tells sensitive people they're too much. And I want to thank you for being here, for listening, for doing this courageous work of becoming who you truly are. If this resonated with you, I'd love to know, what's the hardest thing for you to stop explaining? What would it feel like to just let yourself be without defense? Share your thoughts in the comments, because your vulnerability might be the permission someone else needs to stop explaining too. If this spoke to you, consider subscribing and sharing this with someone who's still exhausting themselves trying to be understood. Sometimes the most healing thing we can hear is that we don't have to explain ourselves anymore. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for your authenticity. Thank you for being exactly who you are.